What was the extremely rare lightsaber form invented by Yoda's species? Greetings Acolytes and welcome back to the archives. We have always known very little about Yoda's species, with the most reliable fact we know being that they are exceptionally powerful in the Force. It's our current understanding that every member of Yoda's species is not only innately Force sensitive, but that they have a connection to it that is far beyond anything seen in other species. However, it seems the trade-off for this amazing potential and long life is that they are not physically gifted. They are very short and physically weak, always having to make adjustments to their lifestyle in order to measure up to the world that surrounds them, which brings us neatly to their approach to combat. While we don't often see Jedi of Yoda's species actively entering into a battle, whenever the need arises, they always seem to have a unique way of tackling their enemy. And in today's holocron, we are going to be analyzing the extremely rare lightsaber form that was invented by a member of Yoda's species for that very purpose. So, Acolytes, let us open a holocron and begin. Before though, we upload holocrons every single day, so if you've been enjoying the daily Star Wars lore, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny, we have foreseen it. The lightsaber form that we'll be breaking down today is when one fights with their lightsaber telekinetically. Despite seeming like this could be something any Jedi could do and should be doing, we have really only ever seen two beings do this consistently in the lore to the point of making it their natural form in combat. Interestingly, this lightsaber style doesn't actually have a name like most of the other techniques do, but it is simply referred to as Kinetic Combat. We trace the origins of Kinetic Combat to a member of Yoda's species, one who lived during the time of Revan and the Old Republic. This member of Yoda's species was Vandar Tok'er, and he to this day remains one of the most mysterious of the 6 members of Yoda's species that are named in the lore. Unlike many of the other members, Master Vandar speaks with a plain dialect instead of the backwards way that the others typically do. Yaddle in canon also speaks plainly, but for a long time in Legends she didn't. But we digress. Vandar is also the only one who has olive skin that looks more human than the shades of green shared with his brethren. And to top it all off, Vandar is the only member of Yoda's species that has shared their surname with the wider galaxy. Vandar Tok'er sticks out in so many categories that it almost doesn't seem surprising that for his final staple of individuality, he invented one of the most challenging lightsaber forms ever. Like Yoda, Vandar was a master of Form 4 Ataru, but as the Jedi got older, he began to withdraw from the physical aspects of combat, choosing mostly to remain on capital ships and give commands to Republic fleets. However, when he did enter battle himself, he wielded 2 green Shoto lightsabers and dueled exclusively using telekinesis, using the lightsabers apart from himself. It should be noted that we are not entirely certain whether or not Vandar actually invented Kinetic Combat. However, this form is not seen used by anyone before this time, and the only other person to use it in the lore and legends is Kreia, who existed at the same time that Vandar did. This means that it's likely that she studied his lightsaber form and adopted it for her own use much later. This actually makes sense, because Kreia too had been a Jedi consular, and not only that, but a Jedi historian. While there aren't any records that indicate she specifically trained under Master Tok'er, Kreia would have respected him enough to study him as well as his species. And since we know that Kreia herself is also incredibly talented with the Force in many aspects, especially telekinesis, it gives credence to the fact that she is able to use Kinetic Combat. Kreia actually took it a step further though, by wielding 3 full-length purple lightsabers at once. The clear question here is, why don't Force users employ this technique? The strength of Kinetic Combat are quite plain. Being able to manipulate multiple lightsabers through telekinesis alone allows one to attack at a range, with Vandar being capable of sending his lightsabers to fight for him up to 60 feet away. This would also theoretically allow one to conserve their own physical energy for further situations, while having a near-perfect balance of defense and offense. Their limbs are safe from the ever-present threat of dismemberment, and it is extremely difficult for an opponent to land a single hit, as even if one is able to penetrate the barriers of the floating blades, the puppeteer of these lightsabers still has time to move out of the way. In a way, Kinetic Combat might just be one of the most overpowered ways to use a lightsaber next to Trakata, but just like that discouraged form, it also has its weaknesses which are equally glaring. It is not perfect. There is a question of whether one even has the capability to do it in the first place. On the surface, Kinetic Combat seems like something that any Force wielder should be capable of. simply using telekinesis and the lightsaber. But it's far more complex than that. The sheer amount of a focus and concentration that it takes for a force wielder to lift an object, then manipulate it with the same speed and precision as they do with their own hand and lightsaber is extremely difficult. Yoda did say that size doesn't matter, but the accuracy in which an object is used is an entirely different animal. The subtle gestures, spins, movements, and parries in lightsaber combat are challenging enough, but taking the physicality completely out of that and only using the force is nigh impossible. Translating all of one's strengths purely telekinetically is again also nearly impossible. Like using the force to keep an entire machine running with each of its individual parts. One's focus has to be magnified on their lightsaber and each of his movements all of the time. Now multiply that by 2 or even 3 weapons. In a duel, they must also be aware of their opponent and their next step, aware of their surroundings, and even subtle changes in the force. Not only that, but they have to passively concentrate on making sure that their own force shield stays intact so that an opponent cannot just grab their lightsabers out of the air. With all of this in mind, we still haven't even gotten to the fact that force wielders still need to remember how to move around properly while in combat should they need to dodge or gain better footing. It is nearly impossible for anyone short of Jedi Masters with decades of experience to accomplish any of this. And then we have to factor in their natural talent with telekinesis, because some Jedi simply aren't as naturally attuned with it. Kreia and Vandar were certainly far more adept at telekinesis than most beings, which allowed them to do this in the first place. Even if one were to train for a lifetime, one lapse in concentration will cause the lightsabers to react a second too slow, giving an opponent the opportunity to leap in and strike at the user's completely undefended body. And while earlier we said that they could just move out of the way, there is still the possibility that they react too slowly due to having their entire focus on their lightsaber. Kinetic combat is not something that is as straightforward as it sounds, because it literally brings even the most powerful force wielders' concentration to their very limit of power, leaving them exposed in many areas. Even powerful people like Sidious and Nihilus could potentially do this without too many problems, do not because of the risks. None of this is to say that kinetic combat is in any way a bad form to use though, as it is extremely effective, but the ability to master it should not be understated whatsoever, especially on such a fine-tuned level like this. Having said that, we wanted to bring this back to Vandar Tokare himself, and talk about how interesting it is that each of the members of Yoda's species have preferences in lightsaber combat to make up for their own physical shortcomings. Yoda himself became a master of Ataru on a level never seen before. He was able to simply jump and climb over all of his opponents, slip their guards effortlessly, or overwhelm them with a storm of blows before they knew what was happening with overwhelming strength. Yaddle became a master of many esoteric powers. She was adepted to Terminus on Yoda's level, and knew the ways of Morchiro, the power to slow someone's vital signs with the Force itself. While this isn't shown in canon, we likely can summarize that Yaddle was not trying to harm Dooku in their duel, and of course, Vandar decided to not even be bothered entering a fight physically, but instead, he chose to wield his lightsabers with the Force so that he could reach his opponent when he could not. Vandar, being of a smaller stature, actually works in his favor with kinetic combat. We said earlier that should the opponent manage to pierce the wall of the sabers, that it would leave the user exposed. But for Vandar Tokare, as such a small target, it made even more challenging for his enemy to strike him down. The opponent would have to overextend themselves to get at him in any way, giving Vandar an opening with his floating weapons to strike them down. Not to mention, Vandar was extremely long-lived just like Yoda. He had multiple lifespans to perfect kinetic combat to the point where it was likely as second nature to him as fighting with his hands would be. All in all, kinetic combat is one of those techniques that many believe to be overpowered, but may not know the intricacies that would make it completely ineffectual in the hands of an inexperienced wielder. Anytime a lightsaber leaves the hand of a Jedi, it usually means they are performing a saber throw. In this way, they can use simple nudges with telekinesis to keep the lightsaber spinning and then return it to their hand. But even doing this is met with warning from blade masters, as it leaves one without their weapon for a split second. But anyway, my friends, what are your thoughts on kinetic combat? And do you think that it is very useful for someone like Vandar? What are your thoughts on this unique lightsaber form developed by Yoda's species? And again, if you enjoy the Star Wars daily lore, consider subscribing. And as always, my friends, May the Force be with you always.